Hello, welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Dnipro River area where there has been no advancements by anyone. The Ukrainian forces continue their pressure by trying to hold their foothold across the Dnipro River. The Russian forces have so far been unable to push them back across. However, it is reported that they are gathering more and more troops and artillery in this direction, trying to bombard the Ukrainian positions to a point where they retreat themselves, or gathering enough troops to storm their positions. We then move on to the Zaporizhzhia area where there are conflicting reports. First off, there are reports of continuous fighting in this direction, where we get this video here, which shows a transport of troops of the Ukrainian forces which was hit by Russian artillery. And after the vehicles were disabled, the Ukrainian forces advanced by foot. Meanwhile, we also get reports that the Ukrainian strategy has switched from offensive operations to defensive operations, where Zelensky has ordered to build fortifications, trying to hold their locations instead of advancing further, and therefore we may see a switch in the dynamic here in the Zaporizhzhia front. We then move on to the Avdiivka area, where we see that the Russian forces have advanced both in the north and in the south. Starting out in the northern direction, the Russian forces have managed to capture the final parts of the forest area here next to the coke plant, and with that they have reached the first buildings by the coke plant. With this, we see that the Russian forces will likely build up further troops until they have enough to start storming the Avdiivka coke plant. So we'll likely see that the Russian forces will go for control over Stepova very soon, as that is a prerequisite to them storming the coke plant. Because although they have managed to push out the Ukrainian forces from Stepova, not holding it will allow the Ukrainian forces to start counterattacking the area. So the Russian forces need to gain control over Stepova, make sure that there's no tunnels or other fortifications the Ukrainians still have control over in the Stepova direction before they start storming the industrial area. And talking about industrial areas, we have the industrial zone here in the southeast of Avdiivka. The Russian forces now have full control over it after the former Wagner soldiers combined with the Russian Ahmed units started storming the final parts with a tank covering their advances. We have these sets of videos. The first one you're familiar with, as this is the one I covered in my last video, with a Russian tank by itself attacking a Ukrainian base here in the industrial zone and constantly bombarding the same building over and over again. However, this time around we have this video here which shows the Russian forces, the soldiers who were present in the area, watching the whole thing. So we see that there were some Russian soldiers in one of the buildings in the area, and they have this lookout area. So this location position is located in a basement in one of the buildings, and it has an exit right next to the surface where there's a hole in the building where they have their outlook from. But with this, we see that the Russian forces were present in the area. However, they were taking cover, and this looks like a small squad unit. There's also this follow-up footage where we see two Russian soldiers bringing supplies in what seems to be water to the front and to their base here in the basement. So why is this footage significant? Because two things. First off, it shows that there were Russian soldiers present, most likely in the residential area here to the south of the industrial zone, because it seems to be houses, not really these industrial buildings. So with that, we see that the Russian forces likely have control over some of the residential buildings right next to the industrial zone. It could also be here further south or east of the industrial zone. Then we also get the second thing, which is that these Russian soldiers didn't really seem to have any mortar or artillery on them, which means that they couldn't provide any support. And at the same time, we see that the tank was likely associated with this platoon of Russian soldiers and was working with them, which is why we see it return, likely to either resupply or cover them. So with that, we see that the Ukrainian forces withdrew after the return of the tank. So with that, we see that the Russian forces now have full control over the industrial zone, and the developing parts right now would be the eastern parts, where the Russian forces also managed to enter and get a foothold within the forest area here to the north of the industrial zone. So what comes next is that the Russian forces will likely attempt to gain control over further areas here in this section. They'll likely start attacking the water treatment plant here in the north of the industrial zone. They'll likely start pushing within the forest area in the northern and western direction, and likely try to get a foothold in the southern parts as well. They'll also seem to attack the quarry area and the residential zone here to the south of the industrial zone, and try to connect with the southern parts here to form a firm line. The offensive operations by the Russian forces continue as they storm the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian forces have established a new defensive line here in the western parts of the industrial zone, with the forest area between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. They've established a fortification here in the central part where the road connects the two areas, and with that they will have one defensive position by the start of the residential area. We also see that they have numerous fortifications and trenches here in the area, which means that the Russian forces will likely have a hard time trying to take control over the quarry. However, with the Russian forces having control over all roads in and out of the area, the Ukrainian forces will likely start a slow retreat out of the residential area here to the south of the industrial zone, and as well as here in the central parts, we'll likely see that the Russian forces will attempt to storm the Zaporizhzhia area again, where they will try to gain control of it and move on to the roads here connecting to the southern parts of the residential area. With the Ukrainian forces having fortifications and prepared defenses here by the eastern outskirts of the residential area, they'll also likely have them at the southern parts. With that, the Russian forces will be forced to focus here on the residential area with heavy trenches and defenses by the Ukrainian forces. So we'll likely see the Russian forces storming the forest areas and try to gain control over the Ukrainian fortification, using their storm units with the former Wagner soldiers combined with the Rosgvardia units to storm the Ukrainian positions and gain control over the fortifications, trenches, and defensive areas. Moving on further north in the Bakhmut direction as well as the Avdiivka direction, we see that there's been no developments in these areas. It is mainly just artillery fights taking place, as neither side can afford to relocate further units in these directions. We're seeing most units by the Ukrainian forces being used in the defense of Avdiivka, as well as in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson areas. We're seeing most Russian forces in the northern parts, as well as Avdiivka, with also a significant amount by the Bakhmut direction. So with that, we see that the Ukrainian and Russian forces are focusing their forces in different areas, and that is where we're seeing territorial changes, with the Ukrainians having more in the Zaporizhzhia front, therefore advancing there, as well as in the Kherson direction, advancing there, and the Russian forces advancing in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas, with them having more forces in those directions. So we see that the Ukrainian forces continuously try to pressure the Russian forces by opening up new fronts or trying to expand the currently open fronts, while the Russian forces are trying to concentrate their forces in the direction of Avdiivka to try and gain control over the area, and in the Bakhmut direction to negate the Ukrainian counteroffensive after the fall of Bakhmut. If the current trend continues, we'll see that the Russian forces will go more on the offensive, attacking areas like Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and Kupiansk as they try to improve their positions ahead of the spring season, while the Ukrainian forces will try to focus on defense and building up their forces for yet another offensive in the spring season. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.